The instructors announced the ice trial with the same cold sharpness that defined the frozen landscape itself. The cadets had trained for months, but no one expected the instructors to take away every piece of heat gear the moment the group stepped onto the white plateau. The wind howled across the open field and sliced into exposed skin like a warning. The alien trainees immediately clung to their thermal packs, only to watch the instructors walk down the line and strip every warm layer, heating module, and protective cloak out of trembling hands. One alien cadet protested until the cold hit his chest and silenced him. Another whispered that she could already feel frost settling on her secondary joints. Panic spread quickly. None of the alien cadets were adapted to this environment. Most of them came from warm planets with dense atmospheres, soft breezes, and regulated climates. Even those from colder worlds relied on artificial heating to survive extreme temperatures. Without it, the cold crept into bones and slowed nervous systems. The instructors watched the growing fear with unreadable expressions. It was clear that the trial was designed to test not just endurance, but composure under pressure. Only the human cadet, Rowan, remained steady. He stood near the edge of the group, his breath fogging in the air, his face already reddened by the chill, but his eyes alert. He adjusted the strap of his cracked helmet, already aware that the visor had taken damage during the last training cycle. While others begged the instructors for at least minimal heat protection, Rowan observed the terrain in long, thoughtful glances. He saw everything: the jagged rocks half buried in snow, the distant rise of ice ridges, and the faint outline of dried vegetation trapped beneath the frost. He also noticed the way the instructors positioned themselves. They were not shielding their eyes from the wind. They were not offering sympathy. They were waiting to see who broke first. When the last piece of heat gear was confiscated, the lead instructor announced that the trial officially began. Survive the night without artificial warmth. The order echoed across the ice and drifted toward the desolate horizon. Several alien cadets immediately began shaking in fear, not just from the cold, but from the knowledge that no one in their species had ever lit a fire with primitive tools. Fire was something studied in theoretical safety courses, not created by hand. Rowan felt the sting of cold through his sleeves, but instead of panicking, he focused on slowing his breathing and lowering his energy output. He had grown up hearing stories from mountaineers and old survivalists who taught him that panic accelerated frostbite and exhaustion. Calm preserved heat. Calm preserved energy. Calm kept a person alive. He scanned the group and saw that one alien cadet was already struggling to keep her limbs moving. Her species had thin protective membranes along the arms and legs, and the cold stiffened them almost instantly. Another cadet curled inward and tried to trap fading warmth against his chest. Rowan understood that if the group continued like this, the trial would end in medical evacuation. The instructors would intervene, but only after permanent damage had begun. The wind pressed harder against the plateau. Ice crystals danced in the air, carried by sharp gusts that cut visibility with each shift. Rowan tightened his jaw, then crouched and pressed his gloved hand into the snow. The cold bit sharply, but he forced himself to feel the layers beneath the surface. Snow, then a thin crust, then something brittle and dry. Good. That meant plant matter. That meant potential tinder if he gathered enough of it. As the cadets huddled and trembled, Rowan took a step away from the group. One instructor noticed but did not stop him. She simply watched him with narrowed eyes, as if curious to see how far he would push instinct before fear caught up. Rowan walked toward a ridge where the wind had thinned the snow. As he knelt, the frost stung his knees, but he kept his movements steady. He brushed away the top layer and found what he hoped for: dried roots, thin grass, and brittle fragments of bark that had been preserved by the cold rather than softened by decay. He gathered a handful, testing each piece for dryness. Several cracked cleanly between his fingers. Perfect. Behind him, an alien cadet shouted that his legs were starting to go numb. Another asked whether the instructors planned to let the group freeze. Rowan ignored the cries, not out of cruelty, but out of focus. He knew he had only limited daylight left, and once the sun dipped behind the horizon, temperatures would drop further. If he did not prepare now, no one would last long enough to worry about morning. When he returned to the group, several cadets stared at the bundle of brittle plants in his arms with confusion. One asked what he planned to do with dead grass. Rowan did not answer. He scanned the field again, this time searching for the right kind of stone. Not all rocks sparked. He needed something with metallic properties, iron-rich stone that could generate sparks if struck correctly. He walked toward a cluster of dark rocks protruding through the snow. He picked up one, then another, then a third. He tested each by scraping them together lightly. Nothing. Then the fourth stone produced a faint metallic scrape. That was promising. He pocketed it and kept searching until he found a partner stone with similar density. The cold worsened, and he felt it prickling inside his gloves and seeping through his boots. Several alien cadets were already struggling to stay upright. One instructor finally stepped forward and told the group that the night would get colder and only those who adapted would survive. Rowan caught the implication. The instructors would not help. That meant everything rested on what he could build with what he had. He returned to the group and set the brittle plant matter in a small mound. He carefully broke the cracked visor from his helmet, separating the reflective thermal layer. The aliens gasped, unsure why he would willingly break his own protective gear. Rowan positioned the curved visor piece toward the sun, checking the angle. Even with weak winter light, it could focus heat enough to warm tinder. He tested the angle again, then placed the smallest fibers of bark beneath it. For the first time, a quiet spark of hope moved through him. The cold tried to steal his movement and cloud his thoughts, but he pushed through it. He knew the trial was designed to crush those who relied on tools instead of ingenuity. But he also knew something else. Fire existed long before machines. Fire came from knowledge, patience, and the willingness to endure discomfort long enough to coax life from cold materials. The instructors watched him with growing interest, as if recognizing that he had already stepped onto a different path than the rest. The other cadets watched him too, shivering but drawn to the only person who was not frozen by fear. Rowan inhaled slowly, letting the freezing air burn his lungs. The night had not even begun, but the first step toward surviving it had. Rowan remained crouched beside the fragile mound of dried plant fibers, but his eyes were no longer on the visor or the brittle grass. He shifted his attention to the landscape itself, scanning every rise and shadow with the quiet intensity of someone who knew that survival depended on more than one desperate attempt at fire. The wind cut across the plateau again, sharper than before, and he watched how the air currents carried loose snow in long, swirling trails. He needed to understand how the environment behaved, because fire could not survive without careful placement. A flame could die faster in wind than in water. He stood slowly, ignoring the stiffness gathering in his joints, and walked toward a ridge where the terrain dipped and rose with sharp irregularity. The alien cadets behind him stayed close to one another, trembling visibly. None of them followed him. None had the strength for exploration now. He reached the ridge and crouched again, brushing the frost off a patch of ground. Beneath the snow, he found rough stone marked with streaks of mineral residue. He scraped the surface with his glove, revealing patches of iron-rich material, dark and metallic. These stones could create sparks if struck hard enough. He tested another area farther down the ridge and found similar compositions. This discovery steadied him. The environment was not generous, but it offered opportunities for someone willing to dig into its brutality. He continued his sweep along the ridge and reached a patch of land where the wind was less aggressive. The incline broke the airflow just enough to create a small natural shelter. He observed how the snow here had formed a thicker layer, meaning the wind rarely reached this spot with full force. A fire could survive here. He mentally marked the place, then returned to studying the broader terrain. The sun hovered low on the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the ice. That meant the temperature would drop sharply soon, and he had little daylight left to identify every resource the frozen plateau could offer. He moved to a cluster of jagged rocks, some protruding vertically like thin blades. He tapped each stone lightly, listening for differences in pitch. A metallic ring meant density and iron content. A dull thud meant uselessness. He collected the stones that rang. When he turned toward the east, he noticed a patch of darker coloration beneath the snow. He knelt and brushed it away carefully, revealing more dried vegetation trapped under a thin crust of ice. He dug with his bare hand for a moment, feeling the sting of freezing air attacking the exposed skin, but he pushed through it until he unearthed enough material to be useful. He packed the brittle matter into his jacket to keep it from shattering in the wind. As he worked, he sensed movement behind him. One alien cadet had forced himself to follow, though his steps were shaky. The cadet stopped a few meters away and watched in confusion, his eyes darting between Rowan's hands and the torn visor piece still tucked under the human's arm. Rowan did not speak, and the cadet did not ask questions. The cold was draining both speech and thought from most of the group, and Rowan knew conversation would only slow him. He continued scanning the ridge line and noticed a shallow depression between two boulders. Snow had piled on one side of the depression, forming a natural wall that blocked part of the wind. The opposite side had just enough space to shield a fire from both gusts and drifting snow. He visualized where he would place the stones, how he would anchor the tinder, and how he would protect the flame until it grew strong enough to sustain itself. It would be difficult, but it was possible. His attention shifted again, this time to the sky. Thin clouds stretched across the horizon, and he studied the way the sun's angle changed the color of the snow. A faint orange tint reflected off the surface, indicating that dusk was closer than it appeared. He needed more than tinder. He needed layers of fuel, thin bark, larger sticks, and something dense enough to create lasting heat. He walked farther from the group, choosing a direction where the ground dipped into a small basin. As he approached, he noticed faint cracks in the ice and crouched down, peeling away the top layer. Beneath it he found fragments of driftwood, washed here by some long-gone stream or released from thawed ground earlier in the season. The wood was dry despite the frost and snapped cleanly when he bent it. He gathered several pieces, then searched deeper into the basin. He found thicker branches tangled in frozen soil. He loosened the ground with his boot, working them free with slow, deliberate movements. His fingers grew numb, and the cold crawled up his arms, but he kept forcing the branches loose until he had enough to build a small but sustainable fire. When he returned to the plateau, he saw the instructors observing him with interest. One instructor had her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on him with an expression that bordered on analytical respect. The instructors were not allowed to interfere, but nothing prevented them from studying how each cadet reacted to adversity. Rowan understood that everything he did was being evaluated. He also understood that most of the alien cadets were already near collapse. He moved toward the natural windbreak he had found earlier and arranged the stones into a shallow bowl shape. He placed the driest fibers in the center and layered the driftwood nearby. Not too close, not too far. He needed to create a gradient of fuel so the fire could grow naturally. Before attempting to spark anything, he studied the airflow again. He knelt beside the stones and observed how the wind funneled between the boulders, testing the movement of air with small pinches of snow. He watched how the snowflakes drifted, where the wind pushed hardest and where it slowed. Every pattern mattered. Fire needed breath, but not assault. After studying the airflow, he picked up one of the metallic stones and tested its weight in his hand. The weight felt right, dense enough to resist impact, but light enough to maneuver with precision. He steadied his breathing, grounding himself in a rhythm that both calmed him and preserved heat. He struck the stones together gently at first, watching the angle. The sparks were faint, barely visible, but real. He adjusted his grip, focusing on sending sparks directly onto the tinder. He practiced the motion several times without fully committing to the strike. A wrong angle would waste precious energy and risk scattering the tinder. The cadets who watched grew silent, not out of comprehension, but out of a fragile, instinctive hope that someone else understood what none of them had been trained to know. Rowan stopped briefly when he noticed a glimmer of reflected light near the horizon. The clouds were thickening, and dusk would fall faster than expected. He needed to be precise now. He struck the stones again, harder, producing brighter sparks. The tinder twitched under the brief flicker of heat. He protected it with one hand, shielding it from incoming gusts. His hands trembled from cold, but his focus remained unbroken. The instructors shifted slightly, acknowledging that he had reached the point where preparation ended and execution began. With every detail memorized, the airflow, the placement of fuel, and the timing of light, he prepared for the moment when a spark would finally catch. The night drew closer, and he knew the plateau would only grow more lethal. But he also knew he had understood the land well enough to challenge it. Now all that remained was to prove that knowledge could outlast cold. Rowan tightened his grip on the stones as his fingers stiffened under the cold's relentless pressure. He could feel the numbness creeping slowly from his fingertips to his palms, threatening to rob him of the dexterity he needed for the next step. The fire would not ignite through sparks alone. He needed something more controlled, something that would allow him to generate sustained heat even when the sun disappeared entirely behind the horizon. The cracked visor, still resting against the snow-covered rock where he had left it, caught the fading light with a faint metallic shimmer. He picked it up, turning it in his hands as he examined the reflective layer embedded within the surface. The visor had been designed to deflect heat and glare during high-intensity drills, but with the right angle, its curved surface could concentrate light into a thin, bright point. That point could ignite the smallest tinder if the conditions were right. He angled the visor toward the sun, shifting its position until a thin circle of intensified light appeared on his palm. The heat was weak, barely noticeable, but it existed, and that was enough to give him direction. He knelt carefully beside the mound of brittle fibers and arranged them into a shape that would catch heat efficiently. He shredded the smallest pieces between his fingers, creating a fine layer of tinder that would respond quicker than the thicker grass and bark beneath it. His movements were slow but deliberate, each one timed to preserve energy. As the light dimmed, he repositioned the visor again, searching for the exact curve that would create the strongest focus. A narrow beam formed briefly, landing directly on the center of the tinder pile. The warmth was subtle, but Rowan held the visor steadily, refusing to let the faint glow slip away. For several minutes he maintained that focus, adjusting the angle whenever the weak winter sun shifted behind passing clouds. The cold gnawed at his exposed skin, but he kept his breathing steady, refusing to lose control of his muscles. It was not enough. The sun would vanish too soon. He needed another method, one that did not rely on daylight. He set the visor aside gently, careful not to scratch the reflective surface, and reached for a flexible branch he had found earlier. The branch had been buried beneath frozen soil, and although it was stiff from the cold, it still bent without snapping. He pulled a strip from one of the torn straps on his pack and wrapped it around the ends of the branch, creating a makeshift bow. He then searched for a straight, sturdy stick to use as a spindle. The first one he picked up split down the middle when he tested it, but the second held firm. He shaped the bottom of the spindle with the edge of a stone, smoothing it enough to rotate freely without slipping. Beside the stones, he found a flat piece of bark that could serve as a baseboard. He carved a shallow notch into it, deep enough to hold the spindle but not wide enough to let it escape. Every piece mattered. Every angle mattered. Every breath mattered. He wrapped the strap around the spindle once, then held the bow firmly in his right hand. He positioned the spindle against the baseboard and placed the heel of his left hand on top, anchoring it with just enough pressure to keep it upright while still allowing rotation. When he pulled the bow back, the spindle spun. When he pushed it forward, the motion reversed. The friction generated a faint whisper, barely louder than the wind. He repeated the motion, faster this time. The wood began to darken where the spindle met the baseboard. Smoke followed soon after, a thin, wavering thread that curled upward before dissolving in the icy air. His hands trembled from the strain, and the cold bit into his knuckles, but the hint of smoke pushed him into a deeper determination. He continued the rhythm, forward, back, allowing his body to fall into a mechanical consistency. The muscles in his arms burned, his palms screamed against the pressure, but the spindle turned faster and faster until smoke thickened around the small indentation. A tiny ember formed, barely holding its shape, glowing weakly like a dying star. Rowan inhaled sharply, but did not allow excitement to break his focus. He set the bow down carefully, cupping the ember with the baseboard as though holding the breath of something alive. He transferred it into the tinder nest he had prepared, pushing the tiniest fibers around it to trap the heat. He leaned in close, shielding the ember from the wind with his entire body. A slow exhale warmed the bundle. The ember brightened slightly. He exhaled again, steady and controlled. A faint glow spread through the fibers, but the flame refused to appear. The cold threatened to choke the ember before he could feed it enough heat. He reached for the visor again, positioning it so the last remaining sliver of sunlight struck the tinder from above. The combined warmth of the ember and the concentrated beam pushed the fibers closer to ignition. Rowan adjusted the angle one more time. A wisp of flame flickered, weak, unstable, but real. It vanished almost immediately, smothered by a sudden gust that slipped past his shoulder. But he saw it. The fire had tried to live. He refused to let it die again. He tightened the tinder around the ember, breathed into it gently, then angled the visor lower, focusing the last remaining ray directly into the small hollow. A second flicker appeared. This one fought harder. It snapped forward, catching the edge of a curled strip of bark. Rowan shielded the flame with both arms, lowering his face until the icy surface of the visor brushed his cheek. The spark grew. A thread of flame rose from the tinder, trembling like a newborn creature uncertain of the world it had been born into. Rowan fed it the smallest fragment of dried grass. It flared, consuming the offering eagerly. The light reflected in his eyes with a sharp gleam, half relief, half triumph, that he forced himself not to express outwardly. Several alien cadets stared from a distance, but none dared move closer. The instructors stood at the far edge of the plateau, silent but attentive. One instructor tilted her head slightly when the flame stabilized, a subtle shift that revealed unexpected approval. Rowan added another piece of driftwood, ensuring the flame climbed the fuel gradually rather than being overwhelmed by a sudden increase in mass. The fire responded with growing confidence, crackling softly in the windless pocket he had chosen earlier. He breathed deeply, letting the warmth finally touch his frozen skin. The fire was still vulnerable, still young, but it existed. It was alive. It was his. And as long as he continued building with care and precision, it would survive the coming night. Rowan held his breath as the flame steadied, the slender tongue of fire wavering but no longer shrinking. It had survived its first few fragile seconds, and that alone filled him with a quiet surge of resolve. The cold air clawed at the edges of the flame, but he had chosen the location with precision, and the natural windbreak protected the fire just enough for it to gather strength. He leaned closer and added a thin strip of bark, watching it catch, curl, and blacken as the flame consumed it. The sound was faint, barely louder than the whisper of snow shifting across the plateau. Yet to him it felt like the beating heart of a living thing. Heat touched his fingertips. It was weak, more suggestion than sensation, but compared to the merciless cold around him, it felt like defiance. He let the warmth seep into his skin for a moment before turning back to the task. A fire that small could not be trusted. It could vanish with one careless movement or one sudden gust. He reached for the stones he had arranged earlier and adjusted them in a tighter semicircle around the flame's base, narrowing the opening where the wind could reach. The stones radiated the first hints of warmth, though it would take time before they gathered enough heat to create a protective thermal pocket. Rowan reached for the visor fragment, which he had set aside once the flame had taken hold. He inspected it under the faint glow. The reflective surface was scratched from earlier work and partly warped from the cold, but it still held a curve capable of focusing heat. He wedged it into the snow at an angle behind the fire, allowing it to reflect some of the light and warmth back toward the tinder. This made the flame brighten slightly, its edges lifting with new confidence. He examined the wood he had collected. The larger pieces would not burn yet. They were too thick and would suffocate the infant flame. He needed transitional fuel. He found a medium-sized branch that retained enough dryness but still allowed airflow once burning. He shaved thin curls from it using the edge of one of the iron-rich stones. The slivers fell into his palm, forming a light pile. He sprinkled them near the flame, not directly onto it. The heat crawled toward the shavings, pulling them inward as the fire grew hotter. A soft crackle followed. Rowan watched with intense focus, making sure the fire spread evenly and did not collapse one direction or another. As the fire grew steadier, he began expanding the stone barrier into a full circle. He packed snow around the stones, reinforcing them and creating a kind of crude insulation. The snow melted slightly where the heat touched it, then refroze, welding the stones into a firmer structure. This stability was crucial. He had no intention of letting one accidental shift ruin hours of brutal effort. After establishing the barrier, he crouched on the side closest to the incoming wind and examined how the smoke moved. It trailed upward in a thin column, bending only slightly. That meant the airflow was ideal. Not too weak, not too strong. He allowed himself a small exhale of relief. The environment was hostile, but for now, it worked with him. The alien cadets kept their distance, but he could sense their eyes fixed on him. Some of them trembled violently, hugging their own torsos in a desperate attempt to retain body heat. He knew they would not last long like that. The fire would need to be strong enough to warm more than one person soon, because the cold intensified with every passing minute. He lifted one of the heavier branches he had dug from the frozen soil earlier. It carried more weight and promised a longer burn if he could prepare it properly. He split it carefully using repeated strikes with the denser stone, creating two thinner halves that could ignite more easily. Splitting wood was always harder in the cold, but he managed to fracture it along the grain. He placed the halves beside the fire to warm them first, not burn them. Wood that came directly from frozen ground needed time to shed the worst of its chill. Once the interior warmed, it would catch faster and burn longer. Rowan's movements grew slightly steadier now that he had warmth nearby, but he refused to let his guard down. A fire was alive, but it was also fragile. He lowered his face to the flame again, adding another small cluster of shaved wood. The flame expanded upward, gaining height and color. Red deepened into orange. Orange shifted toward gold. Rowan positioned the two split halves on opposite sides of the flame, leaning them gently so they formed a small triangle with the fire at the center. This structure allowed airflow to continue while giving the fire more material to grow. When the wood began to blacken along the edges, Rowan understood that the fire had finally gained enough force to consume larger fuel. He reached for one of the driftwood pieces and placed it across the growing structure. The crackling grew louder. Heat washed against his hands. His skin prickled from the sudden shift in temperature, but he welcomed the feeling. He sat back for a moment, allowing himself to absorb the glow. The fire, now fully alive, glowed against the white of the snow like a star buried in ice. He felt some strength return to his fingers, though the cold still clung stubbornly to his joints. He knew he still had work to do. A fire could warm part of the camp, but only if he maintained it throughout the freezing night to come. He stood up slowly, stretching his stiff muscles, and walked a short distance to gather more snow-packed branches. Some cracked under minimal pressure, but others retained enough structure to be fuel once dried. He returned with an armful and arranged them near the fire to warm. Behind him, one alien cadet approached hesitantly, stepping closer until he could feel the heat brushing his frozen skin. The cadet gasped softly, as though surprised the warmth was real. Rowan gestured silently for him to sit near the outer edge, where the heat reached but did not crowd the flame. Another cadet moved cautiously forward, drawn by instinct rather than courage. Rowan allowed her to settle on the opposite side. The instructors observed from a distance, but no one intervened. Rowan fed another piece of driftwood to the flames and watched as the fire accepted it with crackling hunger. The plateau glowed faintly in the widening circle of warmth, and the trembling among the cadets softened as the heat spread through their limbs. Rowan felt the fire's strength settling into his body as well, pushing back the cold that had threatened to claim him earlier. The fire was no longer a fragile idea. It was a presence now, steady, warm, and resilient. He knew it would survive the night if he cared for it. And he would. Because the night had only just begun. The fire's glow deepened as the night settled over the plateau, wrapping the frozen expanse in darkness so absolute that the horizon disappeared. Only the soft orange halo cast by the flames pushed back the cold, forming a fragile island of warmth in a world carved from ice. Rowan fed another branch into the fire and watched as sparks jumped upward, carried briefly by the rising heat before vanishing into the air. The wood cracked loudly, as if defying the cold that pressed from all sides. The cadets who had gathered closer now sat in tight, silent circles around the flames, their bodies angled toward the warmth. Frost still clung to their eyelashes, and their movements remained stiff, but the sharp edge of panic had faded. Rowan could see the subtle shift in their expressions, the way their eyes softened, their shoulders loosened, and their breathing slowed as the fire continued to radiate steady heat. He knew the worst danger had passed, but the night remained long, and he needed to ensure the fire would survive until dawn. He rose slowly, feeling the stiffness in his knees, and walked to the pile of branches warming beside the stones. The fire's heat had evaporated the frost from their surfaces, leaving them ready to burn. He selected 2 thicker pieces and placed them onto the fire with deliberate care. The flames reached upward eagerly, embracing the new fuel. He leaned in, studying the smoke as it curled upward. The airflow remained stable. The windbreak still held. Everything he had built continued to work in his favor. As he adjusted the position of a half-burned branch, he sensed movement beside him. One cadet, a tall male with a trembling jaw, shifted closer. His voice was weak, roughened by hours of cold. He thanked Rowan quietly. Rowan nodded but kept his focus on the fire. He did not require gratitude. Survival was reason enough. Another cadet, a smaller female whose limbs had nearly frozen earlier, whispered that she could finally feel her fingers again. She pressed her hands toward the flames, watching with awe as the heat returned color to her skin. Rowan observed both of them briefly, noting the signs of recovery. The fire provided more than survival. It restored something inside them that the cold had threatened to extinguish: clarity, hope, and presence. Once he was satisfied that the fire had stabilized, he stood and scanned the area for additional fuel. The plateau was dark, but the moon crept above the ridge, providing faint illumination. He walked beyond the edge of camp, stepping carefully to avoid slipping on ice hidden beneath soft snow. The air outside the fire's warmth cut sharply against his face, reminding him that the night still held teeth. He found another cluster of branches partially buried under a drift and dug them free, shaking loose the snow. These would last for several hours if burned gradually. When he returned to the fire, several cadets straightened as if expecting instructions. Rowan set the wood down and resumed tending the flames, adding smaller pieces first before feeding the thicker ones. The fire roared higher, sending waves of heat across the gathering. The cadets edged closer, their trembling replaced with slow, relieved exhales. The instructors remained silhouettes in the distance, standing motionless against the moonlit snow. They did not approach the fire or the cadets, but Rowan felt their attention like a steady weight on his back. They were evaluating, measuring, comparing. The trial was not simply about enduring the cold. It tested ingenuity, leadership, and the ability to remain calm when stripped of every comfort. As Rowan worked, he sensed the instructor's conclusions forming long before dawn arrived. Hours passed. The moon arched across the sky. The fire remained alive, fed carefully and consistently. Cadets took turns resting near the warmest side, stretching their hands toward the flames and thawing their frozen limbs. Some whispered quietly among themselves, processing the night's terror and the relief that replaced it. Rowan listened without engaging, his focus anchored to the fire. The night softened eventually. Dark blue light seeped across the horizon as dawn approached, faint but unmistakable. Rowan felt a shift in the air, less sharp, less suffocating, more willing to yield to life. The fire no longer struggled. It burned with steady confidence, fueled by enough wood to last through the morning if needed. The cadets stirred as the sky brightened. Their faces, once contorted with fear, now held a mixture of exhaustion and astonishment. Several looked at Rowan with expressions he had never seen directed at him before. Respect, gratitude, disbelief that one person could create so much warmth in a world that had tried to take it from them. The first instructor stepped forward when the sun finally crested the ridge. Her boots crunched through the crusted snow with decisive weight. She stopped at the edge of the fire's light, her expression calm but acknowledging the undeniable. She announced that the trial had ended. Rowan did not straighten as the others did. He simply placed another branch onto the fire, his last small act of care before stepping away. The instructor approached him directly. She studied the fire, the stones, the visor, the careful structure he had built through night and freezing wind. She remarked that most cadets in the Academy's long history had failed the ice trial even with equipment that had been generously provided in earlier eras. She added that Rowan had succeeded with almost nothing. The cadets around him lowered their heads, not in shame, but in acknowledgement of the truth they had lived through. The instructor ended her evaluation by stating that Rowan had not only endured the trial, but had ensured the survival of every cadet present. He had transformed a fatal night into a controlled challenge. Rowan nodded once, accepting her words quietly. He felt no pride in them. Pride belonged to victories won alone, but the fire had become more than his own. It had become the center of the group's survival, the core that held everyone together through the worst hours. As the morning light grew stronger and the cold receded further, Rowan stepped back and let the fire burn down naturally. He watched the embers glow softly, pulsing with the rhythm of something that had fought hard to exist. The cadets gathered themselves, preparing to leave the plateau. Some paused beside Rowan, offering quiet words before moving on. Their voices were soft but steady, voices of cadets who had endured and learned. When the instructors signaled for the group to follow, Rowan gave the fire one last look. The stones around it still held warmth, and thin trails of smoke lifted into the air like fading memories of the night. He turned and walked after the others, his steps slow but sure. The trial had asked for survival. He had given more than that. He had given warmth, structure, and a way forward when the world had offered only ice. The fire behind him dimmed as the wind shifted, but its impact did not. By the time the group reached the edge of the plateau, the cold no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a challenge he had already answered. The trial was over, and the conclusion was simple. In a place where heat was stolen, Rowan created his own. And in doing so, he ensured that no one walked out of the ice trial alone.